Welcome to this tutorial video which will focus on the marker editing panel. This contains all of the tools necessary to fix gaps, alter trajectory keys and filter your data. It's very important to note that you should fix any labeling swaps or errors in your data prior to filling gaps. All the gap filling algorithms in Shōgun will look at the data before and after a gap in order to predict a marker location. These will fail if there are labeling errors. Straight away from loading in a trial, Shōgun's heat map will give us some clues as to any gaps that are in our data. We can see these yellow regions on the time bar, and the top half will show there's some unlabeled markers in the selected regions. To find out where these gaps occur, we can bring up the data health view. To do this, I'll split the view vertically and switch to data health view. We can see all of the gaps in this instance occur in and around the pelvis, specifically on the left front waist for the majority of the gaps. To window the gap, we can do a number of things. We can double click in the data health view on the gap and it will show the missing marker, or we can double click down on the time bar and the same thing will occur. In order to fill our gaps and view the gap and its trajectory paths, we'll want to bring up the graph view. I find it very useful to have the 3D perspective and the graph view open at the same time. So let's go back to our first gaps. Here you can see we have a number of very short gaps on the left front waist over a short period. We could go in and fill each of these gaps individually. For example, this first gap. If I double click, it will frame the gap and I can look at our filling options. As this is a very short gap, interpolation is a perfect option. It will look at the data immediately before and after the gap, and it will use a spline fill for that region. Like so. We now have a continuous data range that we can see in 3D. As there are a number of small gaps, and I can view that the line passing through the gap looks sensible, I can select the whole range of data, select ranges, and fill using interpolation. Again, looking back in 3D, I can now see it's a continuous trajectory for this whole marker. If we jump to our next gap, however, we can see that we have a motion that's non-linear. Our actor starts rotating towards the left and then comes back towards the right. If I was to use an interpolation on this range, for example, the fill will not take that rotation into account, and we end up with a strange looking fill. So let's undo this and look at the other options we have to play with. What we can do is look at the rest of the marker placement, and we can see that the pelvis actually forms a rigid object. All these markers on the pelvis are going to move in the same pattern as our gapped marker on the left front waist. So if we select them, we can now see that this fill rigid option has become available. Again, if I select the range and hit fill rigid, it will copy the pattern of these markers onto our missing marker. And we can now see that for that range of motion, we now have a sensible looking fill. If you look at the default blade marker set, we can see there are a lot of rigid objects in our markers. For example, the hand, the forearm, the upper arm, the shoulders, the thorax, and the head. This makes this a great labelling option. Let's look at our next gap. What we can see here is all of our markers are missing for one period of the take. Again, the movement is non-linear, so an interpolation will not be sensible. However, we can also not do a rigid fill as the markers are missing. If we look at our list of options, next one down is fill using constraints. Now, due to Shōgun's much improved solving, we can see that the pelvis bones and spine bones are all in a sensible location over this gap, and our red missing markers are again in sensible locations. So we can fill into these positions for the selected range, and we'll use our labelling skeleton as the basis for this fill. Again, as you can see, we now have a really good fill for this gap. The only time this sort of solution would not be viable is a position where the solve has not put the bones in a sensible location. The next thing down is our filters. If we zoom to a region at the end of this data, I know that there is a few noisy keys right towards the end. This sort of high frequency noise can be filtered out using some of Blade's filtering options. There are some default filters, very light, light, medium and heavy, and we can also set up our own custom filters. These filters are additive, so they can be applied multiple times. For this reason, I'd recommend going in with a very light option in the first instance and then reapplying a similar filter. So we can see the X trajectory on this marker has a lot of noise over this range, and we can see it flickering around in 3D. We can apply a very light filter, and you can now see that trajectory is much smoother over that range. Hope this has given you some useful information. Please continue watching the videos in the series for more information.